Number 10, False Spy. In March 2018, a French nanny found herself in a convoluted plot of manipulation and deceit, with her murder being the end result. 21-year-old Sophie Lionette was hired as an au pair by fashion designer Sabrina Coiter and her boyfriend Osim Medouni to take care of their baby. It was honestly a pretty sweet gig since they were high-profile French millionaires. Sophie had no idea what she'd be getting into, though. Jealousy clouded Sabrina's mind. Sabrina was the ex-girlfriend of a former Boyzone member, Mark Walton, and regularly felt like the nannies were being recruited by him to spy on her. She was beyond paranoid and truly believed Sophie applied to the position with the sole purpose of spying. At some point, her obsession got so bad that she installed cameras around her place to try and catch her nanny doing something wrong red-handed. And Sophie wasn't the only nanny who'd been through this, she just happened to be the most unfortunate one. When Sabrina couldn't find any solid proof, she decided to torture Sophie instead. Sabrina and her boyfriend's first disturbing course of action was to waterboard her. They tried to make her confess about her non-existent relationship with the ex-Boyzone member. They also wanted her to confess that she's stealing from them and spying on behalf of Walton. When Sophie didn't confess and told them she had no idea what they were talking about, they couldn't just let her go and tell people what they did to her. So, they did what any sadistic psychopath would do. They drowned her in a bathtub and then burned her body. Thankfully, Sabrina Coiter and her boyfriend were convicted and were both given lifelong sentences. Number 9, Way Too High. In October 2021, a Pennsylvania babysitter was arrested after he got high and stabbed the kid's mom to death. 26-year-old Lavarius Watson was hired to take care of 41-year-old Elizabeth Leonard's kids, but their relationship wasn't strictly professional. Watson had been doing the job for Elizabeth for a while, and they had grown comfortable with each other as well, so much so that they regularly smoked marijuana together. It was a pretty normal day when the two met up and shared an edible laced with THC. What wasn't normal, though, was the fact that Watson had an adverse reaction to the drug, which made him walk into the kitchen, come back with a knife, and then stab Leonard in the stomach. Oh, and he just didn't do it once, he did it 5 times, which meant that she had basically had no chance of surviving. To make the scene even more horrifying, a 10-year-old child was also in the home when the incident happened. Now, after what he describes as regaining consciousness, Watson realized what he had just done and broke into tears. And not being able to live with the guilt of his bloodied hands, he called up police muttering, "Why did I do that?" and came clean about everything. When the cops arrived at the scene, they found Elizabeth's body propped up against the front door. Number 8, Bingo. In March 2022, a babysitter murdered a mother and father while their baby slept in the other room. He did it after he found out the couple was going to throw him under the bus for stealing over $30,000 from a bingo hall. 53-year-old Stanley Elliott had been a regular babysitter for 61-year-old Jeffrey Hibbert and his wife Michelle since 2019. They were all responsible for the bingo hall burglary, but the couple decided they wanted to pin it on Elliott. Now, Elliott was on bail when he discovered Hibbert's plan to point the finger at him and walk away scot-free. It was enough to put him over the edge. Apparently, Hibbert asked Elliott to babysit his son while the couple went out for drinks. But when they returned in the early hours of the following day, an argument broke out between the three about the whole burglary stitch-up. It wasn't just a verbal fight, though, as Elliott decided that he'd had enough and stabbed Hibbert 58 times in the neck and torso. On top of that, when his wife tried to call the emergency services, the babysitter slit her throat as well. He then proceeded to dump his clothes and flee the scene on his moped, but was later arrested at his own home. Elliott was then sentenced to life in prison. Number 7, A Noble Sacrifice. In November 2020 in Colorado, a brave teenage babysitter was shot to death while preventing theft on the job. The babysitter was taking care of a young girl at a house in Windsor when she spotted 32-year-old Trevor George trying to steal a truck parked in the driveway. Not really knowing what to do about the situation, she decided to confront the thief and stop him from taking the family's Dodge Hellcat. Little did she know the thief was armed. When she tried to intervene, Trevor fought back. He pulled out a gun and opened fire on her. Moments later, the child's mother returned home only to see her babysitter shot dead, and Trevor fleeing the scene in her husband's truck. She instantly called 911 and proceeded to hide in the house's crawl space with her baby until police officers arrived on the scene. If there was any consolation for anyone, however, it was the fact that Trevor was caught and arrested while traveling in the Hellcat near Fort Collins. He's been charged with first-degree murder. Would you do what the babysitter did in this situation and try and stop the thief, or would you stay inside and call the police? Tell us in the comments below and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Number 6, Horror Show. In October 2012, a father who'd been away on a business trip received the most harrowing voicemail of his life. The nanny he hired to watch over his children while he was away killed them. Kevin Krim was on his way back from JFK Airport in New York when he received the voicemail from his wife. When he pressed play, all that he could hear were screams and crying, saying that their 2 children were dead. The couple had hired the nanny, Yoselin Ortega, a couple of years prior when Kevin's wife Marina was pregnant with their third child. Over the years, she'd been a pretty normal nanny for the most part, even helping with the chores and other housework. However, it seems like financial concerns may have taken her mind to the darkest of places, as she waited for an opportunity to teach her rich employers a lesson, all because they wouldn't pay her more. When Marina went out with the toddler and left Ortega alone with the other two children, she grabbed a knife from the kitchen, invited the kids over to the bathroom, and stabbed them to death. The details of the killing were so brutal that one of the jurors had to be dismissed. When Marina finally returned to the Manhattan apartment, her children were nowhere to be found. This obviously triggered a panic response as she called out to them and searched everywhere, only to stumble upon the bloody horror scene in the bathroom when their nanny had stabbed herself too. Yoselin Ortega ended up surviving. She was arrested, but pleaded insanity and was eventually sentenced to life in prison after a trial that unfolded over 6 years. Number 5. Walk the plank. In August 2021, a Nevada man was forced to walk off the edge of a cliff by a neighbor whose children he babysat. 27-year-old Roy Jaggers used to regularly babysit his 27-year-old neighbor's sons. They had a pretty normal thing going on for a while until, well, she accused him of hurting one of her boys. Jaggers didn't really understand what was going on, and before he had time to react, the woman's boyfriend and her former lover pounced on him and handcuffed him. Once he was fully subdued, they took him into a shooting range to torture, burn, and stab him. Plus, to add insult to injury, they made him strip off all his clothes and walk off a 30-foot or just about 9-meter cliff. As if that wasn't enough, the lady's ex-boyfriend was waiting at the bottom of the mountain with a shotgun. He put the final nail in Jaggers' coffin by shooting his already brutalized body. The following morning, police got reports of a dead body at the base of a Las Vegas cliff, with the coroner reporting that he died of shotgun wounds. All 3 suspects were arrested within the next few hours and charged with the murder. It's still unclear why she believed Jaggers did anything harmful to her kids. Number 4. Love is Blind. In Australia in the 1980s, a man's infatuation for his children's babysitter got so out of hand that he had to eventually murder his own wife to be with her. Chris Dawson, who's now 73, hired his former high school student to look after his kids in the early 1980s. As time passed, he grew ever closer to her and they developed a secret romance. But there was a problem. He had a wife that he still loved, and he just couldn't leave her for the babysitter. Of course, that didn't stop him from trying, though, as he kept making problems out of nothing for his wife Lynette Dawson. He even explored the possibility of hiring a hitman to take her out quietly. He couldn't formulate a plan that was solid enough, though. Lynette wasn't someone who'd fall for his cunning ways. He would often go on fake business trips just to spend time with the babysitter. He also accompanied her to her high school formal as her date, just to ward off any teenage boys who were attracted to her. So yeah, the obsession was real. Fast forward a little bit and Lynette goes missing. Chris Dawson gets married to the babysitter. Fast forward a little more, that former babysitter confessed to a friend she suspected her husband of murdering his first wife and dumping her body somewhere. Chris Dawson has pleaded not guilty, the trial is still ongoing, and the case remains unsolved. According to Dawson, he loved his wife more than anything else on the planet. Number 3. Dumped in the woods. In September 2017, Florida police received reports of a missing nanny after she failed to pick up her employer's kids from school. 3 days later, her body was found in the woods. 56-year-old Jennifer Fulford had been working for real estate investor Reed Berman for almost 6 years, and she'd been a great nanny to his kids as well. So it was pretty suspicious and uncharacteristic when she didn't show up to pick the children up from school. After calling her phone several times, Berman decided to call the police and inform them instead. A search ensued for Jennifer. She was last seen leaving her dentist's office. Oddly enough, her purse was found on the floor of Berman's home, but the wallet and cell phone were not. $300 were also withdrawn from the joint account that she shared with her husband Robert Fulford. This led police to review the ATM machine for surveillance footage, which showed 53-year-old Scott Nelson using her card to withdraw money. Police tracked him down and took him into custody. And while he didn't admit to his crime initially, Fulford's abandoned car was found in a parking lot 2 days later with his blood-stained clothes and a bunch of other incriminating stuff in it. The only thing that remained now was finding the nanny herself. After a day of searching, a police helicopter finally spotted her in a wooded area. An autopsy showed that she'd been tortured, bound, and gagged before being stabbed and suffocated to death. Nelson was then charged with murder, kidnapping, burglary, carjacking, and will now spend the rest of his life behind bars. It's still unclear what his motive was. Number 2. Financial difficulties. In October 2022, a Hampshire woman was found dead at her own house. The prime suspect, a boy that she used to babysit. 47-year-old Bonnie Harwood was a babysitter in her youth and was very close to 32-year-old Matthew Reynolds as she looked after him during her teens. In fact, the two used to go camping together as well. The bond they once shared wasn't enough for Matthew to feel any remorse or guilt when his mind wandered toward the thought of murdering his old nanny. Apparently, he just lost his job at a builder's yard and was addicted to drugs and almost out of money. However, rather than looking elsewhere or even asking for help, he decided to murder Bonnie. Why? Well, because she was an easy target, as she not only rode around on a mobility scooter, but also had access to drugs, which again was like a jackpot for Matthew. He broke into her Alton house in the middle of the night and stabbed her to death. He then took off with some of her money and drugs. Her dead body was discovered the next morning, and it didn't take long for police to point the finger at Matthew. His DNA was all over her bloody clothes. His explanation, on the other hand, was that she just had a nosebleed and was perfectly healthy when he left her home after buying some drugs. Number 1. Jack in the Box. In October 2021, a 10-year-old girl accused a San Antonio babysitter of murdering her 11-month-old brother. 27-year-old Miguel Gutierrez had been babysitting the girl and her siblings for a while, and while he showed his good side to their parents, he was secretly a very evil person. When no one was around, he was extremely abusive towards the kids and regularly punched and slapped them. Miguel was especially hard on the 11-month-old child and just couldn't stand him, but according to the girl's testimony, he wasn't necessarily assaulting anyone on the night of the incident. You see, he had a habit of leaving the kids unattended and locking them up in his room while he did other stuff outside. On that night, the toddler fell off the bed multiple times and kept crying, with no sign of Miguel anywhere. The girl, who was only 6 at the time, tried to pick the toddler up and do something, but she couldn't comfort him. Plus, since they weren't allowed to go outside, she couldn't call anyone either. According to her, the toddler felt heavier each time she picked him up, and at some point he went limp and stopped crying. Oh, and while this was all happening, Miguel was outside the house enjoying his food from Jack in the Box. When he finally checked on the kids, he realized what had happened and tried to give CPR to the infant, which obviously didn't work. Once emergency services were called, they rushed him to the hospital, but it was already too late. Miguel was then indicted on murder charges and sentenced to life in prison. Thanks for watching. Would you have jumped to save the family's belongings if you were their babysitter? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time on The Bad Badger.